Do you remember when your grandmother's kitchen smelled like rendering lard every Saturday morning in 1955, that crackling sound floating down the street?
The hot plate should be fairly high for this to make sure that the onion does cook quickly.
The neighbors knew exactly what she was making. Welcome home. You lived through the 1950s when grandmothers kept recipes. But when you grew up, everything was gone. So let's discover these 30 secret recipes nobody wrote down. The 1955 technique of rendering lard from pork fat scraps wasn't just cooking. It was what grandmothers did every time they butchered a pig or bought pork from the butcher, who'd save the fat scraps for customers who knew what to do with them. Detroit kitchens heard the angry sizzle of pork fat cubes hitting hot cast iron, smelled the rich, porky aroma of fat melting and crackling, and watched clear liquid lard pool in the bottom of the pot, while crispy cracklings floated on top. Rendering lard required pork fat scraps, a cast iron pot, low heat for 3 hours, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about when the lard was done. Not by temperature or time, but by sound and smell and the way the cracklings turned golden brown. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't use high heat. What it meant, knowing how to render lard, meant you understood fat, heat, and patience. By 1975, home lard rendering disappeared when Crisco appeared in every grocery store. Modern cooks buy shortening in cans and never learned that Grandma's pie crusts were better because Laird has a different melting point than vegetable shortening, and that knowledge died with the last generation who rendered their own. The 1953 technique of making butter from raw cream by hand wasn't just churning. It was what grandmothers did every week when the milk separator spun cream to the top, and they'd pour it into glass jars, let it sit at room temperature until it clabbered slightly, and then shake it for 20 minutes until butter formed. Milwaukee kitchens heard the rhythmic slosh of cream thickening in mason jars, smelled the sweet tang of cultured cream turning to butter, and watched yellow butter globules separate from thin buttermilk. Making butter required raw cream, a jar with a tight lid, 20 minutes of shaking, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's arms about when to stop shaking, when the sloshing sound suddenly changed to a thud because the butter had formed into a solid mass. You couldn't use pasteurized cream. It wouldn't culture right. You couldn't skip the shaking. What it meant. Knowing how to make butter meant you understood fermentation and fat separation. By 1972, home butter making vanished when grocery stores sold butter cheaper than you could make it. Modern cooks buy butter in sticks and never learned that Grandma's butter tasted different because raw cream has cultures that pasteurization kills and that flavor died when dairies stopped selling raw cream. The 1956 technique of crackling pork rinds in cast iron wasn't just frying. It was what grandmothers did with pig skin after rendering lard, cutting it into strips, salting it heavily, and frying it in its own fat until it puffed up and turned crispy. Chicago kitchens heard the violent pop and crack of pig skin frying in hot lard, smelled the intense pork aroma mixed with salt, and watched flat strips of skin bubble and expand into crunchy cracklings. Crackling pork rinds required pig skin with fat-attached coarse salt, cast iron skillet, high heat, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's ears about when to pull them out. Not by looking, but by listening to the popping slow down to almost nothing. You couldn't use lean pig skin, needed the fat layer. You couldn't use low heat, what it meant. Knowing how to crackle pork rinds meant you understood how collagen renders and puffs under high heat. By 1978, home pork rind crackling disappeared when supermarkets started selling packaged chicharrones. Modern snackers buy pork rinds in bags and never learned that fresh cracklings tasted completely different, still warm, actually porky, not stale, and that texture died when manufacturing replaced cast iron. The 1954 technique of pickling watermelon rinds for winter wasn't just preserving, it was what grandmothers did every August when watermelons were cheap, and throwing away the rinds meant wasting food that could be pickled and eaten all winter. Southern kitchens heard the steady slice of green skin being pared from white rind, smelled the sweet vinegar brine with cloves and cinnamon simmering on the stove, and watched white rind cubes turning translucent in hot pickling liquid. Pickling watermelon rinds required watermelon rinds, white part only, vinegar, sugar, pickling spices, glass jars, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's nose about when the brine was right. Not by measuring, but by smelling the balance of sweet and sour and spice. You couldn't use the green skin, too bitter. You couldn't skip the overnight soak in lime water to keep them crisp. What it meant, knowing how to pickle watermelon rinds, meant you understood that waste was a choice, not an inevitability. By 1976, watermelon rind pickling disappeared when year-round produce meant nobody needed to preserve summer melons for winter. Modern cooks throw away watermelon rinds and never learned they were edible, and that resourcefulness died when abundance replaced scarcity. The 1955 technique of canning tomatoes without store-bought pectin wasn't just preserving, it was what grandmothers did every September when tomatoes came in, and they'd cook them down for hours until they thickened naturally without adding commercial pectin that didn't exist in most kitchens yet. Ohio kitchens heard the steady bubble of tomatoes reducing in copper pots, smelled the concentrated tomato sweetness intensifying as water evaporated, and watched red sauce thicken through reduction, not additives. Canning tomatoes required ripe tomatoes, large pots, all-day cooking, glass jars, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's eyes about when tomatoes were thick enough, not by checking consistency with a spoon, but by watching how the sauce moved in the pot and knowing it was done when it coated the spoon and didn't run off. You couldn't rush it with high heat. It would burn. You couldn't add water. What it meant, knowing how to can tomatoes without pectin, meant you understood that thickness comes from time, not chemicals. By 1974, long reduction canning disappeared when Sure Gel Inserto made it possible to thicken preserves in minutes instead of hours. Modern canners add pectin powder and never learned that Grandma's tomato sauce tasted different because hours of reduction concentrated flavors that quick pectin can't replicate, and that depth died when convenience replaced patience. 5. Recipes down, and you're already remembering how your grandmother's kitchen smelled different than yours, like rendered fat and pickled rinds and tomatoes cooking all day. She never wrote anything down because the recipes lived in her hands, and modern groceries killed every single one. The 1953 technique of making cottage cheese from soured milk wasn't just cheese making. It was what grandmothers did when milk went sour before refrigeration was reliable, heating it gently until it separated into curds and whey instead of throwing it away. Pennsylvania kitchens heard the soft bubble of soured milk heating slowly, smelled the tangy dairy aroma of milk proteins coagulating, and watched white curds forming and floating in clear yellow whey. Making cottage cheese required naturally soured milk, not spoiled, just clabbered, a heavy pot, gentle heat, cheesecloth for straining, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about when to stop heating, not by temperature but by feeling when the curds felt firm enough to strain. You couldn't use fresh milk. It wouldn't separate. You couldn't boil it. Curds would get rubbery. What it meant. Knowing how to make cottage cheese from soured milk meant you understood that sour wasn't the same as spoiled. By 1970, home cottage cheese making disappeared when pasteurization meant milk no longer soured naturally. It just went bad. Modern cooks buy cottage cheese in plastic tubs and never learned that Grandma's cottage cheese tasted tangy and alive because natural souring created flavors that store-bought cottage cheese doesn't have. The 1956 technique of smoking bacon in a backyard smokehouse wasn't just curing meat. It was what grandfathers did with fresh pork belly, rubbing it with salt and brown sugar, hanging it in a small wooden shed in the backyard, and burning hickory wood for days until the smoke penetrated the meat and preserved it. Rural kitchens heard the crack of hickory logs being split for the smokehouse, smelled the sweet hickory smoke drifting across the yard for 3 days straight, and watched pink pork belly turn deep mahogany brown from smoke. Smoking bacon required pork belly, curing salt, brown sugar, a smokehouse, even a small shed worked, hickory wood, 3 days of tending the fire, and the knowledge that lived in Grandpa's nose about when bacon was smoked enough, not by time, but by smelling when the smoke had fully penetrated the meat. You couldn't rush it with high heat. Meat would cook instead of smoke. You couldn't skip the cure. What it meant, knowing how to smoke bacon, meant you understood that preservation was transformation, not refrigeration. By 1975, backyard bacon smoking disappeared when supermarkets sold pre-sliced bacon cheaper than you could cure it yourself. Modern cooks buy bacon in plastic packages and never learned that home-smoked bacon tasted completely different. More smoke, less water, actual pork flavor, and that intensity died when industrial smoking replaced backyard smokehouses. The 1954 technique of rendering beef tallow for pie crusts wasn't just fat rendering, it was what grandmothers did with beef sweet from the butcher, cutting it into small pieces, melting it slowly in cast iron, and using the pure white tallow for pie crusts that were flakier than anything made with butter or Crisco. Boston kitchens heard the quiet sizzle of beef sweet melting in cast iron, smelled the clean, beefy aroma of tallow rendering, and watched white fat turning clear and liquid while crispy bits sank to the bottom. Rendering beef tallow required beef sweet, the hard white fat from around kidneys, a cast iron pot, low heat for hours, cheesecloth for straining, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's eyes about when tallow was fully rendered, not by color, but by watching when all the tissue had released its fat and only crispy bits remained. You couldn't use regular beef fat. Suet was harder and rendered cleaner. You couldn't rush it, what it meant. Knowing how to render beef tallow meant you understood that different fats made different crusts. By 1973, home tallow rendering disappeared when Crisco and butter became cheaper and easier than rendering your own fat. Modern bakers use vegetable shortening and never learned that Grandma's pie crusts were different because beef tallow has a higher melting point than butter, creating flakier layers. And that texture died when convenience replaced rendering. The 1955 technique of making head cheese from pig's head wasn't just charcuterie, it was what grandmothers did after butchering when the pig's head was simmered for hours until the meat fell off the bones, then chopped and pressed into loaves that set up from natural gelatin. Farm kitchens heard the steady simmer of pig's head boiling in enormous pots, smelled the rich pork and bone broth filling the house for hours, and watched meat being picked from bones and pressed into loaf pans to set overnight. Making head cheese required a whole pig's head, enormous pot, all-day simmering, loaf pans, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about how much liquid to leave with the meat. Not by measuring, but by feeling the texture and knowing it would gel from the natural collagen without adding gelatin. You couldn't use lean meat, needed the gelatin from skin and bones. You couldn't rush the simmering. What it meant, knowing how to make head cheese meant you understood that whole animal butchering wasted nothing. By 1977, home head cheese making disappeared when supermarkets sold only retail cuts and pigs' heads weren't available. Modern cooks buy deli meat in plastic and never learned what head cheese was, and that nose-to-tail tradition died when retail cuts replaced whole animals. The 1953 technique of curing ham in a salt box wasn't just preservation, it was what grandmothers did with fresh pork legs, packing them completely in coarse salt in wooden boxes in the cellar, and leaving them for months until the salt drew out moisture and preserved the meat. Southern cellars heard nothing. Curing was silent, but smelled the salt and pork and thyme, and watched white salt slowly turn pink from pork juices over months of curing. Curing ham required fresh pork leg, massive amounts of coarse salt, a wooden box, a cool cellar, 3 months minimum, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's calendar about when to pull the ham, not by schedule, but by knowing how long based on the size of the leg and the temperature of the cellar. You couldn't cure in warm weather, meat would spoil. You couldn't skip the salt packing. What it meant, knowing how to cure ham, meant you understood that thyme and salt were preservatives before refrigeration existed. By 1972, home ham curing disappeared when refrigeration made it unnecessary, and supermarkets sold pre-cured ham year-round. Modern cooks buy spiral-sliced ham in plastic and never learned that salt-cured country ham tasted completely different, saltier, drier, more intense, and that preservation method died when cold replaced salt. The 1954 technique of making soap from bacon grease wasn't just cleaning, it was what grandmothers did with saved bacon fat, mixing it with lye water made from wood ash, stirring it for hours until it saponified, and pouring it into molds to harden into soap bars. Farm kitchens heard the steady stir of fat and lye mixing in cast iron, smelled the sharp chemical reaction of lye combining with fat, and watched liquid soap mixture thickening and turning opaque as saponification happened through chemistry older than written recipes. Making soap required bacon grease saved over months, lye water from wood ash and water, a cast iron pot, hours of stirring, wooden molds, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's arms about when the soap was ready to pour. Not by temperature, but by feeling when the mixture traced across the surface and held its shape. You couldn't use fresh fat, needed old grease. You couldn't skip the stirring, or it wouldn't saponify properly. What it meant, knowing how to make soap from bacon grease, meant you understood that fat plus lye equals cleaning, and nothing was wasted. By 1971, home soap making disappeared when store-bought soap became cheaper than the hours required to make it. Modern households buy soap in bottles and never learned that Grandma's soap was made from cooking waste, and that resourcefulness died when buying replaced making. The 1955 technique of churning buttermilk after making butter wasn't just a byproduct. It was the thin liquid left after butter formed, and grandmothers would save it for baking because real buttermilk made biscuits rise differently than sweet milk. Kitchen crocks held the pale yellow liquid after butter was removed, smelled tangy and cultured from natural fermentation, and produced biscuits and pancakes that rose higher and tasted tangier than anything made with regular milk or store-bought buttermilk. Churning buttermilk required making butter first, saving the thin liquid that separated from butter, letting it sit at cool temperature for another day to culture more, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's baking about how real buttermilk behaved differently in recipes, not from written measurements, but from making thousands of biscuits and knowing that buttermilk from butter making had more acid and less fat than milk. You couldn't use sweet milk instead. Biscuits wouldn't rise the same. You couldn't buy cultured buttermilk that matched it. What it meant, knowing real buttermilk, meant you understood that butter making produced two products, not one. By 1973, real buttermilk disappeared when butter factories dumped the byproduct and stores started selling cultured buttermilk, made by adding bacteria to skim milk. Modern bakers buy buttermilk in cartons and never learned that Grandma's buttermilk was different, actually, from butter, with natural cultures and real tang, and that authentic flavor died when manufacturing replaced home churning. Making vinegar required apple scraps, peels, cores, water, a tablespoon of sugar, a ceramic crock, cheesecloth cover, months of waiting, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's nose about when fermentation had moved from sweet to alcohol to vinegar, not by testing, but by smelling the progression and knowing vinegar was ready when it smelled sharp and tasted sour. You couldn't use metal containers. Vinegar would corrode them. You couldn't rush it or seal it. Needed oxygen for acetobacter. What it meant, knowing how to make vinegar from scraps, meant you understood that fermentation happened in stages and waste was raw material. By 1974, home vinegar making disappeared when cheap white vinegar flooded supermarkets for pennies per gallon. Modern cooks buy vinegar in plastic bottles and never learned that Grandma's apple vinegar tasted like apples because it was made from apples, and that flavor complexity died when industrial production replaced wild fermentation. The 1953 technique of canning meat without a pressure cooker wasn't USDA approved, but it's what grandmothers did before pressure canners were common, packing raw meat into jars, processing them in boiling water baths for 3 hours, and praying the heat penetrated enough to kill bacteria. Kitchen stoves held enormous pots, boiling for hours, smelled like cooking meat and steam, and produced jars of preserved meat that either kept safely or didn't, and grandmas learned from experience which methods worked. Canning meat without pressure required raw meat cut into chunks, glass jars, salt, boiling water bath, 3 hours minimum processing, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's experience about which meats could be canned this way safely, not from USDA guidelines that didn't exist widely yet, but from decades of canning and knowing that fatty meats kept better than lean, that smaller chunks heated through faster, and that you never ate meat from a jar that looked or smelled wrong. You couldn't skip the long processing time. You couldn't can in warm weather. What it meant, knowing how to can meat without pressure, meant you understood risk and made calculated decisions before food safety was standardized. By 1970, water bath meat canning disappeared when pressure canners became affordable and USDA started warning it was unsafe. Modern canners use pressure canners following USDA guidelines and never learned that grandmas canned meat in boiling water for generations, and that knowledge, unsafe by modern standards but functional in practice, died when regulation replaced experience. The 1955 technique of making rennet from calf stomach lining wasn't just cheese making, it was what grandmothers who lived on farms did when they butchered a calf, saving the fourth stomach, abomasum, cleaning it, drying it, and using pieces of it in milk to make cheese because the natural enzymes coagulated milk. Farm kitchens kept dried stomach pieces hanging in pantries, smelled faintly animal and acidic, and used tiny strips of it soaked in water to curdle milk for cheese without buying rennet tablets that most farms didn't have access to anyway. Making rennet required a calf's fourth stomach from butchering, thorough cleaning, salt curing or drying, storage in a cool, dry place, and the knowledge that lived in grandma's cheese making about how much dried stomach to use, not by measuring, but by knowing that a piece the size of your thumbnail was enough for a gallon of milk. You couldn't use other parts of the stomach, only the fourth stomach had the right enzymes. You couldn't skip the cleaning or cheese would taste off. What it meant, knowing how to make rennet from calf stomach, meant you understood that cheese making required enzymes that came from animals before they came from tablets. By 1972, home rennet making disappeared when rennet tablets became available in stores, and most people stopped butchering their own animals. Modern cheesemakers buy rennet in tablets, and never learned it originally came from calf stomachs, and that direct connection connection between butchering and cheesemaking died when retail supplies replaced farm production. 15 recipes down, and you're realizing your grandmother didn't just cook. She transformed waste into food, scraps into resources, and time into preservation. Nothing was garbage if she knew what to do with it. Modern groceries replaced that knowledge with plastic-wrapped convenience. The 1954 technique of rendering chicken fat for cooking wasn't just saving drippings. It was what grandmothers did with chicken skin and fat scraps, cutting them into small pieces, melting them slowly in a pan, and straining the golden liquid fat into jars for frying potatoes and making the best matzo balls. Jewish kitchens in New York heard the quiet sizzle of chicken skin rendering in cast iron, smelled the rich poultry aroma filling the apartment, and watched golden schmaltz collecting in glass jars while crispy gribeens, cracklings, floated on top and got eaten as snacks. Rendering schmaltz required chicken fat and skin saved from multiple chickens, a heavy pan, low heat for an hour, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's tradition about how schmaltz made everything taste better, not from written recipes, but from generations of Eastern European cooking that used schmaltz for everything from frying to spreading on bread. You couldn't use high heat, it would burn. You couldn't use lean chicken, needed the fat. What it meant, knowing how to render schmaltz, meant you understood that chicken fat was as valuable as the meat. By 1976, home schmaltz rendering largely disappeared when vegetable oil became cheaper and healthier in public perception, and when buying whole chickens with skin became less common than boneless breasts. Modern cooks use canola oil and never learned that schmaltz tastes like concentrated chicken and makes roasted potatoes taste completely different, and that flavor died when health trends and convenience replaced traditional fats. The 1955 technique of making blood sausage from fresh slaughter wasn't just sausage making. It was what grandmothers did on butchering day when the pig was killed, catching the blood in a bucket, mixing it with cooked rice or barley and spices, stuffing it into intestine casings, and boiling the sausages until the blood coagulated. Farm kitchens heard the steady stir of blood and rice being mixed in large bowls, smelled the metallic blood mixing with onions and allspice, and watched dark sausages turning firm as blood proteins coagulated during poaching. Making blood sausage required fresh pig's blood, had to be used same day before it coagulated, cooked rice or barley, onions, spices, intestine casings, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about how much rice-to-blood ratio, not by measuring, but by knowing the mixture should be thick enough to hold together, but loose enough to stuff into casings. You couldn't use old blood. It would clot. You couldn't overstuff casings. They'd burst during cooking. What it meant. Knowing how to make blood sausage meant you understood that slaughtering day wasted nothing, including blood. By 1975, home blood sausage making disappeared when home butchering became rare and catching fresh blood became impossible for most people. Modern consumers buy blood sausage at specialty shops, if at all, and never learned that Grandma made it on butchering day because blood spoiled fast and using it immediately was necessity, and that tradition died when people stopped slaughtering their own animal. The 1956 technique of salting fish for winter storage wasn't just preservation. It was what coastal grandmothers did when fish was cheap and plentiful, layering fresh fish fillets with massive amounts of coarse salt in wooden boxes and storing them in cool cellars where the salt drew out moisture and prevented spoilage for months. New England cellars held wooden boxes of salted cod, smelled intensely salty and fishy, and produced fish that had to be soaked for days before cooking but kept all winter without refrigeration. Salting fish required fresh fish fillets, pounds of coarse salt per fish, wooden boxes, a cool storage place, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's tradition about how much salt and how long to cure, not from written instructions, but from generations of coastal living that knew fish needed complete salt coverage and at least a month before it was properly preserved. You couldn't use lean fish. Oily fish like mackerel went rancid, even salted. You couldn't skimp on salt. Fish would spoil. What it meant, knowing how to salt fish, meant you understood that seasonal abundance could be preserved for scarcity. By 1973, home fish salting disappeared when frozen fish and refrigeration made it unnecessary. Modern cooks buy fish fresh or frozen and never learned that salt cod was different, more intense, chewier, requiring soaking and preparation, and that preservation method died when freezers replaced salt boxes. The 1954 technique of making lye from wood ash for hominy wasn't just chemistry. It was what Southern grandmothers did with wood ash from the fireplace or stove, mixing it with water, letting it settle, and using the caustic liquid to soak dried corn kernels until the hulls dissolved and hominy formed. Southern kitchens kept crocks of lye water made from ash, smelled sharply alkaline and dangerous, and produced hominy by soaking dried field corn overnight until the kernels swelled and the hulls slipped off after rinsing. Making lye required hardwood ash, not pine, too resinous, water, a settling period, dried field corn, overnight soaking, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's chemistry about how strong the lye should be, not by pH testing, but by knowing that lye water should feel slippery between your fingers and make dried corn hulls dissolve in one night of soaking. You couldn't use fresh corn, had to be dried field corn. You couldn't touch lye water without rinsing. It would burn skin. What it meant, knowing how to make lye from wood ash, meant you understood that caustic chemicals existed before stores sold them, and ash wasn't garbage. It was raw material. By 1971, home lye making disappeared when canned hominy became cheap and widely available, and when fewer people had fireplaces producing wood ash. Modern cooks buy hominy in cans and never learned it was made by soaking corn in lye, and that wood ash was the original lye source, and that knowledge died when convenience replaced chemistry. The 1953 technique of curing corned beef in brine barrels wasn't just preservation. It was what grandmothers did with beef brisket, making a brine with salt, sugar, pickling spices, and pink curing salt, submerging the meat completely in a ceramic crock or wooden barrel, and leaving it in the cellar for 2 weeks until it turned into corned beef. Irish-American cellars held crocks of curing beef submerged in salty brine, smelled like salt and spices and meat, and produced corned beef that tasted different from store-bought because the cure was slower and the spices were whole instead of powdered. Curing corned beef required beef brisket, coarse salt, brown sugar, pickling spices, pink curing salt, if available, a large crock or barrel, 2 weeks minimum, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about keeping the meat fully submerged, not from written recipes, but from knowing that any meat exposed to air would spoil and ruin the whole batch. You couldn't cure in warm weather. Meat would spoil before curing. You couldn't skip the pickling spices. They prevented off flavors. What it meant, knowing how to cure corned beef, meant you understood that tough beef brisket became tender and flavorful through salt and thyme. By 1974, home corned beef curing disappeared when supermarkets sold pre-brined corned beef year-round. Modern cooks buy corned beef in plastic vacuum packs and never learned that Grandma's corned beef tasted different because home curing used whole spices and longer time, and that depth of flavor died when industrial brining replaced home crocks. 20 recipes down, and you're understanding why your grandmother's food tasted different, not because ingredients were better, but because she knew techniques that took days or weeks and couldn't be rushed. Modern groceries traded that time for convenience, and the flavors died with the method. The 1955 technique of making pectin from apple cores and peels wasn't just thrift. It was what grandmothers did while making applesauce or apple pie, saving the cores and peels, simmering them in water for hours until the natural pectin extract, and using that liquid to thicken jams and jellies without buying commercial pectin. Farm kitchens heard the steady bubble of apple scraps simmering in large pots, smelled tart apple peels concentrating, and watched the liquid turn slightly thick and viscous from released pectin, then strained it and used it for setting jams. Making pectin required apple peels and cores from multiple apples, especially tart green apples, which had more pectin, water to cover, hours of simmering, straining through cheesecloth, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's jam-making about how much homemade pectin to use, not by measuring but by testing a spoonful on a cold plate and seeing if it gelled, then adjusting amounts accordingly. You couldn't use ripe eating apples, not enough pectin. You couldn't boil too hard, would break down pectin. What it meant, knowing how to make pectin from scraps, meant you understood that thickening power came from fruit waste, not boxes. By 1972, homemade pectin disappeared when Sure Gel and Certo made commercial pectin cheap and standardized. Modern jam makers buy pectin in boxes and never learned that apple peels contained natural pectin and Grandma's jams thickened without additives, and that resourcefulness died when buying replaced extracting. The 1956 technique of smoking sausages in the chimney wasn't just preservation, it was what grandmothers did after making fresh sausage, hanging links on rods inside the chimney, not over direct fire but in the smoke path, and letting them hang there for days while the wood stove smoke cured them slowly. Rural homes had chimneys that smelled like smoking meat, watched sausage links hanging in the smoke column, turning darker and firmer, and produced smoked sausage without owning a smokehouse because the chimney did double duty. Smoking sausages in the chimney required fresh-made sausage links, metal rods to hang them across the chimney interior, an active wood stove creating steady smoke, several days of smoking, and the knowledge that lived in Grandpa's experience about placement, not from instructions, but from knowing that sausages had to hang where smoke passed, but heat didn't cook them, usually 3-4 feet above the stovepipe entrance. You couldn't hang too close to heat. They'd cook instead of smoke. You couldn't use green wood, created bitter smoke. What it meant, knowing how to smoke sausages in the chimney, meant you understood that smoke from daily heating could preserve food while warming the house. By 1975, chimney smoking disappeared when central heating replaced wood stoves and chimneys became decorative or unused. Modern homes don't have active chimneys that produce smoke for days, and nobody learned that grandparents used chimney smoke for curing meat because the infrastructure died with wood heating. The 1954 technique of making scrapple from pork scraps wasn't just using leftovers, it was what Pennsylvania Dutch grandmothers did after butchering, taking all the pork scraps that weren't good enough for other uses, simmering them with pork bones until the meat fell apart, mixing the shredded meat with cornmeal and spices, pouring it into loaf pans, and letting it set firm overnight from natural gelatin. Pennsylvania kitchens heard the steady simmer of pork scraps and bones cooking for hours, smelled the porky, herbal aroma of sage and thyme mixing with rendered fat, and watched the cornmeal mixture being poured into pans to set into sliceable loaves. Making scrapple required pork scraps, head meat, organ meat, any trimmings, pork bones for gelatin, cornmeal, sage, thyme, salt, pepper, loaf pans, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands about cornmeal to meat ratio, not by measuring, but by stirring the mixture and knowing it should be thick like porridge, but loose enough to spread into pans evenly. You couldn't use lean meat only, needed some fat and gelatin. You couldn't skip the herbs. Scrapple without sage wasn't scrapple. What it meant, knowing how to make scrapple, meant you understood that butchering day used absolutely everything, even scraps. By 1976, home scrapple making disappeared when fewer families butchered their own pigs pigs and grocery stores in non-Pennsylvania Dutch areas didn't sell it. Modern consumers in Scrapple regions buy it pre-made and elsewhere never heard of it. And the knowledge that pork scraps plus cornmeal plus spices made breakfast food died when home butchering ended. The 1955 technique of rendering suet for Christmas puddings wasn't just beef fat. It was what grandmothers did with the hard white fat from around beef kidneys, shredding it finely, or running it through a meat grinder, using it fresh and rendered in Christmas pudding and mincemeat, where it would melt during steaming and create texture that no other fat replicated. British-descended kitchens heard the grind of beef suet being pushed through meat grinders, smelled the clean, mild beef fat aroma, and watched grated sweet being mixed into dark fruit and spice mixtures for Christmas puddings that steamed for hours. Using suet required fresh beef kidney sweet from the butcher, a meat grinder or very sharp knife for shredding it finely, immediate use before it went rancid, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's Christmas baking about why sweet made better puddings than butter or lard, not from written explanations, but from generations of British baking, knowing that suet's high melting point created different texture and that Christmas pudding without suet wasn't traditional. You couldn't use regular beef fat. Had to be kidney suet, which was harder and cleaner tasting. You couldn't render it first. Needed it raw for proper texture. What it meant: knowing how to use suet meant you understood that different fats behaved differently in cooking, and some recipes required specific ones. By 1974, fresh suet disappeared from most butcher shops when Christmas pudding fell out of fashion and demand dropped. Modern bakers rarely make steamed puddings at all, and if they do, they use vegetarian suet or butter, and never learned that real suet created different texture, and that traditional Christmas pudding died when suet became unavailable. The 1953 technique of making sauerkraut in ceramic crocks wasn't just fermentation. It was what German grandmothers did every fall when cabbage came in, shredding heads of cabbage, salting them heavily, packing them tightly into large ceramic crocks, weighting them down with plates and rocks, and letting them ferment in the basement for weeks until they turned sour. Basements held 5-gallon crocks of fermenting cabbage, smelled increasingly sour and funky as fermentation progressed, and produced sauerkraut that tasted alive and complex compared to canned store version. Making sauerkraut required fresh cabbage, coarse salt, 3 tablespoons per 5 pounds cabbage, ceramic crocks, weight to keep cabbage submerged, 3 to 6 weeks of fermentation, and the knowledge that lived in Grandma's tradition about when sauerkraut was done, not by tasting, but by smelling the fermentation progression, and knowing that it was ready when it stopped bubbling and smelled sour but not rotten. You couldn't use metal containers, would react with acid. You couldn't let cabbage float above brine, would mold. What it meant: knowing how to make sauerkraut meant you understood that fermentation was controlled by salt and thyme, not vinegar. By 1973, home sauerkraut making largely disappeared. When canned and jarred, sauerkraut became cheap and easier than months of basement fermentation. Modern consumers buy sauerkraut in jars and never learned that real fermented kraut tasted different, tangier, more complex, still containing live cultures, and that authentic fermentation died when pasteurization replaced crocks. 25 recipes down, and you realize these weren't just recipes, they were skills that took years to learn, required equipment modern kitchens don't have, and produced food that tasted completely different from anything in stores. Your grandmother knew all of them without writing one down. The 1956 technique of curing olives from raw-picked olives wasn't just preservation. It was what Mediterranean grandmothers in California and other warm climates did when backyard olive trees produced fruit each fall, picking them either green and firm or black and ripe directly from the branches, soaking them in multiple changes of fresh water for weeks to slowly leach out the intensely bitter compound called oleuropein that made raw olives completely inedible, then brining them in saltwater solution with herbs like bay leaves and fennel and lemon slices for months until they slowly transformed into the salty, briny, edible olives that bore no resemblance to the bland, canned black olives from the grocery store. California kitchens with mature olive trees in the backyard over large crocks of soaking olives smelled the bitter tannins gradually leaching out into the water that had to be discarded and replaced, and watched raw, astringent olives that would make your mouth pucker and taste horrible slowly transform over months into the complex, salty, briny olives that tasted like the Mediterranean olives their grandmothers had cured in the old country. Curing olives from scratch required fresh-picked olives that were completely inedible raw due to high levels of oleuropein compound. Lemon slices for flavor and acidity, months of patient brining and waiting, and most importantly, the knowledge that lived in Grandma's patience and experience about when olives were cured enough to eat. Not knowledge from tasting them early because they'd still be too bitter to eat, but knowledge from experience that green olives needed 3 to 6 months of brining and black ripe olives needed even longer to fully cure. You couldn't skip the water-soaking phase. Raw olives were intolerably bitter and impossible to eat without weeks of soaking. You couldn't rush the brining process. Only time removed the bitterness completely. You couldn't use fresh olives without curing. They were toxic in the sense of being inedible. What it meant. Knowing how to cure olives from tree to table meant you understood that olives on trees were completely different from eating olives and required months of careful transformation. By 1975, home olive curing had disappeared almost completely when store-bought olives became cheap and widely available, and when suburban olive trees were planted purely for decoration rather than harvest. Modern consumers buy olives in jars without knowing that raw olives are completely inedible and that the curing process took months of daily attention, and that knowledge died when few people had olive trees and even fewer knew how to cure the fruit. The 1954 technique of making mincemeat with real beef and suet wasn't just pie filling. It was what grandmothers did after fall butchering when the weather turned cold enough to preserve meat, cooking lean beef with dried fruits, warming spices, brown sugar, and shredded beef sweet in enormous pots for hours until everything melded together, packing the rich mixture into ceramic crocks, pouring brandy or rum over the top as preservative, and storing it in the cold cellar where it would age and mature for weeks or months before being used in Christmas and New Year's pies. British-descended kitchens across America heard the steady simmer of chopped beef, apples, raisins, currants, and suet cooking together for hours on the back of the wood stove, smelled the intense, sweet, savory aroma of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, allspice, and beef fat permeating the house, and watched the dark, rich mixture being packed into crocks to age like fine wine until the holidays. Making traditional mincemeat required lean beef, often tougher cuts like neck or shank that benefited from long cooking, shredded beef sweet from around the kidneys, tart apples chopped fine, raisins, currants, candied citrus peel, dark brown sugar, warming spices, brandy or rum for preservation and flavor, and most importantly, the knowledge that lived in Grandma's decades of Christmas baking about how mincemeat improved dramatically with age. Not knowledge from written instructions in cookbooks, but knowledge from traditional baking passed down through generations that mincemeat made in October and aged until Christmas tasted far superior to freshly made mincemeat, and that the beef and suet created richness, depth, and keeping quality that vegetarian versions couldn't match. You couldn't skip the sweet. It preserved the mixture through its antibacterial properties and created the characteristic texture that made mincemeat spreadable in pies. Modern bakers buy jarred mincemeat at stores that contains no actual meat, despite the name, never learning that traditional mincemeat actually contained beef and suet, and that the authentic recipe died when changing culinary tastes made meat in dessert culturally unacceptable. The 1955 technique of salting butter for long-term storage wasn't just seasoning for flavor. It was what grandmothers did immediately after churning butter from raw cream, working coarse salt into the freshly made butter by hand or with wooden paddles in a rhythmic kneading motion, packing it tightly into ceramic crocks or wooden butter molds to eliminate any air pockets that could harbor bacteria, and storing it in the coldest part of the cellar or spring house where the salt preserved it for months through winter and into spring before household refrigeration was reliable or common. Farm cellars across rural America held crocks of heavily salted butter packed under clean cloth coverings, smelled like rich cultured cream mixed with coarse salt, and produced butter that lasted all winter and into early spring because the salt prevented bacterial growth, and the thorough working process that removed all traces of buttermilk prevented the butter from going rancid even without refrigeration. Salting butter for storage required freshly churned butter, still soft enough to work. Coarse salt at approximately 1 tablespoon per pound of butter, though measurements varied by preference and climate, working the salt thoroughly into the butter by hand or with wooden paddles until evenly distributed, thorough extraction of all buttermilk by repeatedly pressing and folding the butter because any remaining buttermilk would cause spoilage, tight packing into crocks with no air pockets, and, most importantly, the knowledge that lived in Grandma's hands from decades of butter making about how much salt was enough and how much working was necessary. Not knowledge from measuring precisely with spoons and scales, but knowledge from experience that butter should taste pleasantly salty but not overwhelmingly, so like seawater, and that all the buttermilk had to be worked out completely or the butter would spoil within weeks, even with salt. You couldn't undersalt the butter. It would go rancid from bacterial growth within a month. Couldn't leave air pockets in the packed crocks. Mold would grow in the air spaces. You couldn't skip the buttermilk removal. Any remaining liquid would cause spoilage. What it meant: knowing how to properly salt and store butter meant you understood that preservation required salt as antibacterial agent, and that working butter wasn't just mixing salt in. It was the crucial process of removing all moisture that would enable bacterial growth and rancidity. The 1953 technique of making yeast starter from wild fermentation wasn't just baking. It was what grandmothers did before commercial yeast was reliable or widely available in rural areas, mixing flour and water together in a crock or jar, leaving it uncovered on the kitchen counter near the warmth of the wood stove, and letting wild yeast that existed naturally in the air and in the flour itself colonize the mixture over the course of several days until it bubbled enthusiastically and smelled pleasantly sour and could leaven bread without any store-bought yeast. Kitchen counters across rural America held crocks of sourdough starter that smelled increasingly yeasty and sour as days passed, got fed with more flour and water every morning like a living pet that required daily attention, and produced bread that tasted tangy and complex from natural fermentation instead of neutral and bland, from commercial yeast that hadn't existed for most of human bread-making history. Making yeast starter from wild fermentation required only flour, water, several days of patient waiting for wild yeast spores to colonize the mixture, daily feeding with fresh flour and water to keep the yeast colony alive and active, warm kitchen temperature to encourage fermentation, and most importantly, the knowledge that lived in Grandma's decades of bread-making experience about when starter was active enough to use for baking. Not knowledge from timing or temperature measurements, but knowledge from watching for vigorous bubbles throughout the mixture and smelling the fermentation to detect the right balance of sour and yeasty aromas and knowing from experience that active starter smelled pleasantly sour like yogurt and doubled in volume within hours after feeding. You couldn't use chlorinated tap water from city water systems. The chlorine killed wild yeast and prevented fermentation. You couldn't seal the container with an airtight lid. Yeast needed oxygen from air to colonize and multiply. You couldn't rush the process. Wild fermentation took days of patience that modern bakers don't have. What it meant: the 1954 technique of canning milk in glass jars without refrigeration wasn't USDA approved even then, but it's what farm grandmothers across rural America did when the family cow produced more milk than the household could drink fresh in a single day. Heating the raw milk almost to boiling point on the wood stove, carefully pouring it into sterilized glass jars while it was still scalding hot, processing the sealed jars in boiling water baths for at least an hour and sometimes longer, depending on jar size, and storing them in the cool cellar where they kept for months without spoiling. Farm pantries and root cellars held rows of glass jars filled with canned milk that had separated slightly during storage with cream floating on top, smelled distinctly cooked and slightly caramelized from the extended heat processing, and provided milk for cooking and drinking all winter when the cow was dry and not producing, or during hot summer months when fresh milk spoiled within hours, in the heat before refrigeration was common or reliable in rural areas. Canning milk required fresh raw milk straight from the cow, clean glass jars sterilized in boiling water bath, processing for at least an hour to kill bacteria, sterilized lids and equipment, and most importantly, the knowledge that lived in Grandma's experience about safety, not knowledge from USDA guidelines that explicitly said home milk canning was unsafe, but knowledge from generations of farm living that understood home-canned milk, carried risks, but also trusted their own senses to know what spoiled milk looked like, smelled like, and tasted like, and never used a jar that seemed questionable in any way. You couldn't process the jars too briefly. The milk wouldn't keep and would spoil within days. You couldn't use jars that weren't perfectly clean and sterilized. Any bacteria would multiply and spoil the milk. You couldn't skip the boiling water processing. Raw milk in sealed jars would go bad immediately. What it meant: knowing how to can milk meant you understood risk, made calculated preservation choices when refrigeration wasn't available or reliable, and trusted your experience and senses over official guidelines that didn't account for the reality of farm life without electricity or ice boxes. These 30 techniques weren't recipes. They were survival skills that grandmothers learned by watching their mothers and grandmothers, practiced for decades until they became automatic, and never wrote down, because writing them down meant you didn't really know them. From 1950 to 1959, kitchens across America still practiced techniques that were already dying, already being replaced by supermarkets that sold everything these techniques produced. Grandmothers rendered their own lard while Crisco sat on store shelves. They churned butter while factories mass-produced it cheaper. They cured meat in salt while refrigeration made it unnecessary. They knew these techniques were ending, but they taught them anyway, hoping someone would remember. Modern groceries didn't just replace these techniques, they erased them. When you can buy bacon for less than it costs to smoke it yourself, nobody smokes bacon. When you can buy butter for less than the cost of cream to churn it, nobody churns butter. When you can buy vinegar for pennies, nobody ferments apple scraps for months. The economics killed the knowledge before anyone realized the knowledge was worth saving. These techniques produced food that tasted completely different from store-bought versions. Home-rendered lard made flakier pie crust than Crisco, Real buttermilk from butter making made tangier biscuits than cultured store buttermilk. Salt-cured country ham tasted more intense than spiral-sliced grocery ham. Wild yeast sourdough bread tasted more complex than bread made with commercial yeast. She learned them by doing, practiced them for decades, and the measurements lived in her hands, not on paper. She knew when lard was rendered by sound, not temperature. She knew when butter was done by listening for the slosh to change to a thud. She knew when sauerkraut was fermented by smell, not by calendar. That knowledge, sensory, intuitive, embodied, couldn't be written in recipes because it wasn't about instructions. It was about experience. These techniques didn't die because they didn't work. They died because modern groceries made them unnecessary, and once they were unnecessary, they became forgotten, and once they were forgotten, they became impossible to recover because the last people who knew them didn't write them down. You remember your grandmother doing these things. You remember watching her hands working butter, or stirring rendering fat, or packing meat in salt. You remember the smells and sounds and the way she never measured anything. That memory is all that's left, because she never wrote it down, and now nobody alive knows exactly how she did it. The recipes died with her, and modern groceries killed them.